It's good to see all of you tonight. We got a lot out of town, I think. Probably people want to go see their fathers. But for the group I got, I'm happy that you're here to worship together. And hopefully this lesson, you'll see it as a benefit to you some way. If you like your Bibles out, turn to Acts chapter 7. I'm going to show you something there very quickly in Stephen's sermon. Before we begin, let me give a defense for Brother Allen. There is part of the trim right here that is not attached to the step. I think Benny Williams showed it to me back in 2014 and told me that right here, this is the danger zone. He said, don't ever come up here right here. That trim will get you every time. It's gotten me 3 times. I think I've tripped 3 times on it. When Bill started worshiping with us, I told Bill the same thing. I said, now look, this is the danger zone. And what did Bill do? He always started his sermons by walking up over that way. You know why? Because this was the danger zone. And I think when Jason was here, I told him the same thing. Don't ever walk up right here. So now y'all all know. So brothers that sit over here, be mindful of the danger zone. Now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about the Bible. And actually, we're going to be talking about the New Testament. For y'all that understand a little bit about computers, maybe you understand the way that computers collect data and store data. And that's by something called clusters. The other day, my hard drive burned out, and I had to do a check disk, and I ran it, and I had to find bad clusters. And my computer found the bad clusters, got rid of them, and then I was able to access my memory and my data again. If you don't understand computers, it's okay because your brain works in a similar way. Your brain remembers memories, recalls knowledge in clusters. As in, your brain doesn't just keep a list of every memory and every bit of knowledge you have and access it by that list. No, what your brain does is it makes groups of data in different groups, and when you need to access that group, it goes to that whole file, that whole cluster, and pulls out what it needs out of that group. You probably have done it before when you don't even know you're doing it. You know, if you're on the car or riding somewhere and you hear a song, does that song sometimes remind you of a memory or an event or somebody you know in your life? How is that possible? Well, that's because your mind stores data in clusters, and that song is in that group with maybe this person and that person, that sort of thing. I think Kenny Chesney wrote a song a long time ago about that, the song I Go Back, and a song would bring him back to a memory. Food does the same thing. Sometimes you eat some food and it reminds you of something else, and it's because that food is in that cluster of memory, that grouping of data, so you can recall something. Y'all that have kids, maybe you've seen the movie Ratatouille. I just got to see it for the first time like a couple of years ago. That was a good movie. At the end, if you remember, if you've seen the movie, and if you don't, it's fine, you'll understand with my comment. There's a guy who's reviewing the restaurant, and he eats the ratatouille, and apparently he's supposed to be this mean review person. But when he eats the ratatouille, the movie shows you that he has a flashback to being a little kid with his mom, and his mom is serving him the same dish. And then he goes on and he writes a wonderful review because the food reminded him of his mom. Why is that the case? How does he connect that food to his mother? Because our mind stores data in clusters, in groupings. And so what I would like to talk about tonight is how we need to have that same type of understanding when we're discussing the New Testament. That we can take the data and the information, the knowledge that we receive from the New Testament, and we need to do the same thing with it. We need to put it in groups, in clusters. When we can understand that and put that information in groups, it becomes easier accessible to us, it's easier to understand, and especially, it's easier to teach when we teach it in clusters. Stephen gives one of the best sermons in Acts here in Acts 7 to the Sanhedrin. And all Stephen is doing is he's showing them a cluster. He's showing them a grouping, and he's hoping that they would see the grouping and that they would make some application. The grouping begins with the story of Joseph. And Joseph was a prophet, but look at verse 9 of chapter 7. Stephen says, talking about Joseph and his brothers, it says, and the patriarchs becoming envious sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. The only point he's making is that Joseph was a prophet, but his brothers rejected him and sold him out. But God was with him. Then he talks about Moses next. Look in verse 25. Now talking about Moses, he says this, for he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. And he goes on to tell the story of how the Israelite brethren rejected Moses. So now we have another prophet, Moses, who was a prophet by God, but what was he? He was rejected. And then you go to the end. Look at verse 52. Stephen says, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who foretold the coming of the just one, of whom you now have become betrayers and murderers. You have received the law of the direction of angels and have not kept it. So the first point that Stephen makes is, look at Joseph. He was a prophet. You rejected him. Look at Moses. Moses was a prophet. You rejected him. And now finally, look at Jesus. Jesus was a prophet. And what'd you do? You rejected him. What is that? That's a grouping. That's a cluster. Stephen says, look, here's 3 prophets, and y'all did the same thing with all 3 of them. That's a grouping. That's a way to teach a lesson. And what was the lesson? That the Israelites have a history of rejecting their own prophets. And Stephen was able to teach that by teaching the grouping. Here's a group that all fits in this category. Now, it works really well with the New Testament books. I just wanted to ask you, how do you picture the New Testament books in your mind? When you just kind of close your eyes and I tell you to picture the New Testament books, what do you picture? Maybe many of us picture something like this. We picture the list. And the list that we learned. Maybe we learned it on a poster somewhere. Maybe we learned it in Bible class. Maybe we learned it in the front of our Bible. And that's fine to have this list. Knowing this list is very helpful when you're looking for what book to turn to, right? You know, some of us still sing the song in our heads because we can't find Galatians. You know, and that's okay. If you can get the Galatians, that's great. But the list is okay. But is this learning the New Testament books in a grouping? Is this learning it in a cluster? No, can you imagine the difficulty, and some of you ladies know, to teach this list to the 2 and 3-year-olds? That can be difficult, and that can be overwhelming. There's 27 books right there they're trying to learn, and it's difficult. I think as we get older and we have a more mature understanding of the New Testament, instead of only picturing the list, we can start putting these books in different groups. And when we can put these books in different groups, we can be more easy at accessing these books in our mind. Now, by the way, the reason why this list exists is because it already is a grouping. That is actually supposed to be a grouping. Maybe we just don't get it. What would be the first group of the New Testament books? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That should be obvious. It's the life of Jesus, isn't it? That's why those 4 books are the beginning of the canon. When we go back to the 2nd century and people start making the codex and they start putting a New Testament all together in one binding, these are the guys that chose to put the books in this order. And you can see why. They said, okay, we got 4 books about the life of Jesus. Let's just put that at the very beginning. The next grouping that they do is the life of Peter and Paul, which is only in 1 book, but it's in the book of Acts. And that's why the Acts is right there. Life of Jesus, life of the apostles. What would the next grouping be? Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, and you keep on going. The next grouping in the canon is the epistles of Paul. And notice the way that they're organized. They're not organized by time. They're organized by largest book to smallest book. Romans is the longest book he wrote. Philemon is the shortest book he wrote. Philemon in the timeline should be right here by Colossians, but it's at the bottom. Why? Because that wasn't the point. The point was to group them from largest to smallest. And that's why they're in the order they are in your Bible. Now, look at Hebrews. Hebrews was cleverly put at the end of Philemon because they didn't know what to do with it. They were like, okay, well, it may have been Paul, probably was at least someone in Paul's party. The person's in Rome. But because they didn't know what to do with it, they just squeezed it at the end of Paul and said, hey, you put it there. You can put it in Paul's grouping or you can put it in the next grouping. We don't care. But that's why Hebrews is located the way it is in the New Testament canon. What's the next book? James. and it's in a group all by itself. And that book stands out by itself too, especially when you think about the way it is. It's an open universal letter. From there on, James begins the groupings of the universal letters. These books were not addressed to a certain group of people. It was addressed to many different people. And that's why you have Peter's epistles next. You have all of John's epistles next. You have Jude's epistles next. And then finally the Revelation. And the thought is that these are the 7 epistles that are written to everybody. They're not Paul's epistles. It's almost like we have the Paul's epistles and the not Paul's epistles. And that's a way you can group the books in your mind. But is this like an easy way to group the books? I can at least tell you for Andrew, this is not an easy way to group the books. My mind doesn't think like this. I can't put the most of the New Testament right there in the middle in one big group. The way that Andrew tries to do it is a little bit different. If y'all remember that came to the Roman study, and this is what kind of made me think about preaching a sermon like this. And I wanted to do it like on a vacation night when maybe there wasn't a lot of people here, a smaller crowd. I asked a question at the beginning of Romans 1. And my question was, what other New Testament books do you put with Romans? And what I was amazed by is I got different answers. All of those answers were correct, but it was just getting to see the different way people's minds work. That they collect and they put Romans in a different category than I put Romans in that category. And that's fine as long as it helps you access the data that's in Romans, your knowledge of the book of in Romans. Now, these are 2 different ways that I do it. And these are opinions, but hopefully you'll be able to see, the method to my madness here. Andrew, one way that I group the books in my mind is by time written. That this is when these books were written, and I'm able to group them with other books that were written around the same time period. The way Andrew does it in his mind is I first think early epistles. And my early epistle books are 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Galatians. They were written sometime in Acts 15, Thessalonians definitely after Acts 17. And these would have been the earliest epistles that we have. Paul wrote these very quickly while he's still doing his missionary journeys. The next group I call is the famine epistles. And the famine epistles in my mind is the 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans. Why do I call them the famine epistles? Because those 3 books are about the famine going on in Jerusalem. He writes 1 Corinthians in Ephesus. And what does he write about in 1 Corinthians 16? He says, be sure to lay aside the support for the needy saints in Jerusalem, right? Then he goes around to Macedonia. He writes 2 Corinthians. And what does he tell them again in chapters 8, 9, and 10? He says, be sure you got the support ready because I'm coming through and you need to assign men to carry that support to Jerusalem for the needy saints for the famine. Then he finally gets to Corinth and he writes the book of Romans. And lo and behold, in Romans 15, what does he ask the Romans to pray for? He says, Romans, will you please pray that the Jews in Jerusalem will accept the gift that the Gentile Christians are giving them now? These are the famine epistles. The famine was going on, and these 3 books were written probably with all in the same year, or at least the same 2 years. The next group I do in my mind is prisoners in Rome. So Paul goes on the 3rd missionary journey. He delivers the funds for the famine, and then he gets into Jerusalem, and if you remember, he gets arrested. He gets accused of bringing a Gentile Trophimus into the temple. He didn't do it, but he got accused of it. When he gets accused of it, the Jews try to kill him. He tries to address the Jews. He says he's going to convert the Gentiles. The Jews get angry, and the Romans have to come and save him. The Romans come and save him. They take him to Caesarea, and then from Caesarea, he gets sent to Rome. And we have that story at the end of Acts. Then Paul begins to write letters in Rome, and that's how we get those first 3 books, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. You read those 3 books, and you learn that all 3 of those books were carried by the same 2 people all at the same time, Tychicus and Onesimus. And they take the book of Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon, and they take them to the church at Ephesus, the church at Colossae, and the brother Philemon who worships at Colossae. Those 3 books go together in my mind. They were written at the same exact time. They were carried by the same messenger. Now, at the end of Paul's Roman imprisonment, he writes Philippians. How do I know that Paul writes Philippians at the end of his Roman imprisonment? What is Philippians chapter 1 about? It's about that Caesar is about to make his decision on whether he's going to execute Paul or he's going to free Paul. Would that happen at the beginning of his imprisonment or the end of his imprisonment? Well, wouldn't that happen at the end? That he would be appealing to Caesar, and now Caesar's finally going to make a decision. I'm going to execute you or I'm going to free you. And that's why I put Philippians in my mind at the end of that prison sentence. Now, what about Luke and Acts? Have y'all ever noticed how Acts abruptly ends? It just ends, right? The book of Luke is addressed to this man named Theophilus, and the book of Acts is addressed to this man Theophilus. Look at the end of Acts with me real quick. And again, these are just some of these context clues that I think helps us put the books in the proper order. The end of Acts is full of adventure. You know, we have the hurricane, we have the snake bite, we have stranded at the island. Paul finally makes it to Rome. He meets the Jewish leaders and he gives them this, speech basically, or sermon about why he's there. And look how Luke ends Acts in verse 30. Then Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own rented house and received all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching the things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ with all confidence, no one forbidding him. Imagine for a moment if this is the only book you had and you read Luke and then you read Acts. What would you be thinking at the end of this verse? Paul's just been imprisoned. He finally makes it to Rome. He's going to appeal to Caesar. And Luke just ends with, and Paul stayed in his house for 2 years and he preached the gospel there. If we were Theophilus, wouldn't be like, but Luke, what happens next? Did he get out? Did Caesar free him? Did he get to go home? Luke doesn't tell you any of that. Why doesn't Luke tell you any of that? Andrew thinks at least it's that's all that has happened. That Luke has written Luke and Acts here as a prisoner with Paul in Rome. And that's all there is of the story. And he writes this to Theophilus saying, hey, this is our story. This is why we're here in Rome. And that's as far as it's happened. In Andrew's mind, I put Luke and Acts with the prison epistles, that they're written there in Rome to explain to people why Paul's in the situation that he's in. After that, we get the final epistles. And I know that is a whole lot. But those are final epistles. All of those epistles are preaching the same message. Go back to what you've already learned. The gospel is already there. Don't turn to a new gospel. The gospel you need is right here in front of you. And then, of course, you have John's works, which is preaching a lot of the same things. Notice that John wrote the Gospel of John when he wrote 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. 1 John is a commentary on the Gospel of John. If you read 1 John, you notice John talks a lot about his senses. He saw the Son of Man. He touched the Son of Man. He was present with the Son of Man. When you read through the Gospel of John, guess what you see a lot of? John was with Jesus. He says, I saw Jesus. He says, I leaned on Jesus' breast. He says that Thomas wanted to touch the holes in Jesus' hands. What is it all about? It's all about the apostles are witnesses of Jesus. And the Gospel of John in 1st and 2nd and 3rd John are all about that. Don't separate the Gospel of John from 1 John. They have the same message. And then finally, here's my question mark. I have no idea when Matthew, Mark, or James were written. I assume it was closer to the end, but I don't know. So I just put a question mark. And I have a question mark in my mind. Here's these 3 books. I don't know where they go. They're in a group to themselves. They're in the I don't know group. But that still works. It's a grouping in my mind that can kind of organize the books so I can at least piece a timeline in my mind. Let me do one more grouping, and then I'm going to show you some verses where we can make these links and these connections. I also can do it by topic, and I imagine that you can do it by topic pretty easily as well. You might have different books in these different topics. But this is, again, how I think about it just as an example. I can group the New Testament books by one. I can do kingdom living books. And in my mind, that's Matthew and James. They're about kingdom living. And I'm going to demonstrate that once I get to the end of this. Also, I've got Old Covenant versus New Covenant. Old Law versus New Law. What books do I put in there? Romans, Hebrews, Galatians. All 3 of those books preaching the same message to different audiences. That there was an old law, but the old law was put away, and now there was installed a new covenant with Jesus Christ. And all 3 of those books explain those books very well. I got books about persecution. In my mind, that's 1 Peter, that's Philippians, that's the Revelation. Those are the encouraging books about how to pass through persecution, how to trust in Jesus no matter what. I also have books about authority. Books like the Gospel of John, the Johns, 2 Peter, 2 Timothy, Jude, also 2 Corinthians. Those books are about authority. They're books about the apostles' authority, about Jesus' authority. There's threats made. If you reject us, you reject God. And that's what those books are about. Also, I have the church books. These are books that are about the church. They're about the universal church. They're about the local church. And they're about the Christian that makes up the church. And those are kind of our bread and butter. The Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, Titus. What's in 1 Timothy and Titus that's about the church? There's in both books. Elder qualifications, right? They're in both books. Most of this stuff is about what we do as a church or who the church is. Then I also have defenses of Paul. In my mind, at least, I have my own topic just called a defense for the Apostle Paul. And that is Luke and Acts. And for some reason, I didn't write Luke right here. What happened to it? But Luke used to be up there. Luke, Acts. When you read Luke from beginning to end and you end in Acts, you get a story. You get a narrative that Luke wrote. Now, that takes a long time. You know why? Because Luke wrote the majority of the New Testament. He only wrote 2 books, but he wrote the majority of the words that make up the New Testament. It's a long story. And there is a story there where Luke explains why Paul is doing what he's doing, why Paul has been imprisoned, and why the Jews are trying to kill Paul. And there's a story that begins there with the birth of Jesus and goes all the way to Paul's imprisonment. Another narrative in Luke and Acts is Luke is pointing out to us, the reader, who the real villain is in the story. Who is the real villain of Luke and Acts? It is the Jewish elite. They're the real villain in Luke and Acts. And if you start in Luke chapter 1, you watch the progression of the Jews becoming worse and worse and worse as you go through the books. The Jewish elite begins with just being an annoyance to Christ, right? That the Pharisees would show up and they would annoy Jesus. And then in the middle of Luke, all of a sudden the Pharisees are saying they're going to get rid of Jesus. And then at the end of the Luke, what do? They plot with the Romans to kill Jesus. And then you get to Acts. And what does the Jewish elite do with the apostles that are teaching Jesus? Well, they imprison Peter and John. And then they come after the whole apostles. And then they beat the apostles. And then they set him free. Then we watch the end of Acts. What are the Jews doing to Paul? They're chasing him from city to city, from Thessalonica, starting up mobs, causing problems throughout the Roman Empire. What did they do at the very end of Acts? Well, now you've got these men. It's not like they're going to Pilate anymore and saying, crucify. Now these men have basically turned into criminals. And they're doing things like taking vows that they're not going to eat ever again till Paul's murdered. And they make plans to murder Paul in the street and kill Romans to get to him. If you're a Roman citizen and you receive the book of Luke and Acts, what are you going to think about the Jewish elite? You're going to go, well, they're the problem. It's not Christianity. It's not Paul. It's not this Jesus. It's the Jewish elite that's been causing problems with the Roman Empire. And Luke identifies them as the villain in his story. 2 Corinthians is Paul defending himself in his apostleship. And what is 2 Peter? 2 Peter 2 is defending Paul and his apostleship. Is it important that Paul's an apostle? He wrote the most of the books of the New Testament. It is very important that Paul is defended by his authority, and the New Testament does that. And finally, I got books about the end of the world. If somebody wants to study with me about the end of the world, where am I going to go? I'm going to go to 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians. Those books right there are about the end of the world and the judgment day. And also, of course, 1 Corinthians 15, the last half of it there. That's a large section about the end of the world. Why is this helpful? Why are we talking about this? Is it just so we can have ratatouille moments where we have flashbacks? If someone comes up to you and says, hey, what does the Bible say about the end of the world? What are you going to do? Well, hopefully your brain can jump in those files and go, okay, end of the world, what do I got? I need to talk to them about 1 and 2 Thessalonians. I need to go to 1 Corinthians 15. What if you know a brother that's having an authority issue? And he just rejects authority and he rebels with authority. And you go and talk to that brother and you say, brother, I think we need to study about these things. And he says, You know what? I'd be okay with studying with you about it. What are we going to study? What are you going to tell them? Well, hopefully you can say, let's study the Gospel of John. That will handle authority, right? And if you know this stuff and you have these things grouped in your mind, you can do something like that. You know, someone doesn't know the difference between the Old Testament and New Testament. Where are you going to go? Well, hopefully you'll be able to go, okay, I need to go to Romans or Hebrews or Galatians, and my answer is going to be in there. And if you can group these things, I think it makes us better teachers, where we can explain the different processes that God has taught us through. Let me show you how this happens in real life. Let's look at that kingdom living one with Matthew and James. I just want you to show you that these books are intricately connected. James says this in 2:5. James says, listen, my beloved brethren, has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he promised to those who love him? Where did James get that from? And he even says to the people, don't you already know, right? Has God not chosen the poor to be heirs to the kingdom? How were his audience supposed to already know that? James is referencing Matthew 5:3, the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's where James got that from. And that's why James is so connected to Matthew. They're about the same thing. I almost think of James as a commentary on the book of Matthew. Let me show you where he does it again. It's really through the whole book. Backwards to James 1:21. James says, therefore lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Especially that part, receive with meekness the implanted word. Where did James get that from? Think about Matthew. Where did James get that from? Out of Matthew. James is referring to the parable of the sower. That's where he's getting that thought from, the implanted word. Matthew 13:23. But he who has received seed on the good ground, when he hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. If we kept on reading James chapter 1, the next thing he says is do not just be hearers of the word, but be doers of the word. Guess what is the next thing Jesus teaches in Matthew 13? He says, you are hearers, but you do not hear. Jesus basically says, I'm not looking for a bunch of hearers, I'm looking for a bunch of doers. James is expounding on Matthew 13. If you understand Matthew 13, you understand James 1. And if you understand James 1, you understand Matthew 13, because these books are about the same thing. They're connected. Let me show you another one. Old covenant versus new covenant. Romans 7:6. But now we have delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. That we should move on to the law of the Spirit and leave the law of Moses alone. Hebrews 8:13. And he says a new covenant. He has made the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete is growing old and ready to vanish away. What is he talking about? The new covenant. It makes the old covenant obsolete. And when Jeremiah said it, it was already growing old and being ready to pass away. Galatians 3:13. Paul says Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. And it is written, curses everyone who hangs on a tree, that the blessing of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles in Christ Jesus, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. We're going to receive the promise of the Spirit through faith because Jesus removed the old law from us. He took the curse away from us. Why would God, let me say it that way, why would God give us 3 books that teach us the same message? Is it not that repetition is key for us to get something? Can there be any confusion on God's part that the old law perished away and the law of faith was installed? After you've read these 3 books, there should be no confusion, because God is very thorough when he teaches something, and he does the same point with these 3 books and in other places. I could have put Colossians 2 up here. It's the same thing. What about authority? Let me show you this. 2 Peter 2:4. He's talking about false teachers. And Peter gives the example of the angels who sinned but cast them down to Tartarus. He did not spare the ancient world but saved Noah. And he uses the example of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, right? Jude also wants to teach against false teachers. Guess what Jude says? Jude says, and remember, the angels that did not keep their proper name has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for judgment of the great day. And also Sodom and Gomorrah. Jude uses the same analogies that Peter uses to talk about the same thing. Why is that? Because the Bible is harmonious. It's teaching the same message. Sometimes it even uses the same examples. One more. This is one we should all know. Ephesians and Colossians. Ephesians and Colossians are sister books. They're teaching the same exact thing with a lot of the same language. Ephesians 2:5. Paul says, even though when we were dead in trespasses, he, Jesus, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up together and made us sit together in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. When did God raise us up? And we were raised up to sit with Jesus in the heavenly places. When did that happen? Well, Colossians tells us. It's the same language. Colossians 2:12. Buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. Those two verses are like sisters. They need each other, and they explain each other that baptism is how God raises us up to sit with Christ in the heavenly places. Also, by the way, many of y'all have had conversations with people about singing, why we sing the way we do. Where do you go? Well, you go to Ephesians 5:19 and you go to Colossians 3:16. Ephesians and Colossians teach the same thing about singing because they're sister books. If you didn't catch it in Ephesians, you're going to catch it in Colossians. If you didn't catch it in Colossians, you're going to catch it in Ephesians. And you can kind of see where I'm going here. Notice here Mark is missing. That's because Mark can be put in all of these categories. I have no idea what to do with Mark. And maybe I would put an authority, but Mark covers so many topics. It's like an introduction to the New Testament. You don't have to group it like this. You can make your own grouping as long as it's helpful for you to understand and navigate through the New Testament. Let me end this with some take-homes. We're going to skip this. This is what I want you to take home from what we've talked about. Number one, the New Testament is repetitive, isn't it? If you didn't catch it now, you're going to catch it later. You're going to eventually pick up the whole gospel because of how repetitive it is. Imagine you had a group of people isolated from the rest of the world, maybe like in North Korea or something like that, and they had a New Testament, but they were missing the book of Jude, they were missing the book of Matthew, and they were missing, you can pick another epistle, maybe Titus. They were missing those three books out of their old bad copy of the New Testament. But they had good hearts, they believed what was in here, and they practiced what they had. I believe that if you got that group and you got our group, we would be practicing the same thing. Why? Because the New Testament is so repetitive. It's almost like God is preserving his word and he's being so thorough. He has backups upon backups upon backups, so you'll get the information. The elder qualifications are in 1 Timothy and in Titus. Why did God record them twice? Because he's being repetitive. If for some reason you don't have 1 Timothy, you can still appoint elders. And I think that's the beauty of it, is the New Testament is so repetitive that it's almost foolproof when it comes to our practices and our beliefs. Secondly, the New Testament has harmony. You see that in the letters that we have. Why does it have harmony? Well, because it was inspired by one Holy Spirit. That's why it has harmony. Why does sometimes Peter and Paul, even though they weren't together, uses the same type of language to explain something? Well, because they were inspired by the same Spirit to do so. That's why. Why can Jude quote basically 2 Peter if maybe they were written in the same time and in different places? Well, because Jude and 2 Peter are inspired by the same Spirit. And that's why we have the harmony that we see. Authors who may have not been together or in the same place can write about the same thing because obviously they have one Spirit that's guiding them. That's why there's no contradiction in the New Testament. If these were just men writing their own opinions, there would be more contradictions than we can count, but that's not the case. And finally, the New Testament can equip you. It can equip you to repair any spiritual issue. But for that to work, what do you have to have? You got to have the New Testament in your mind. If you don't know the New Testament, is it going to repair every spiritual issue for you? No, that's not the way it works. You have to know it so it can equip you to handle any kind of spiritual issue there is. And that's got to be the challenge. That's got to be the goal. Thank you for your close attention. Now, maybe I'm just weird, which might be the case. I don't need people agreeing with me too fast. But a lot of times when I'm riding in the car, that's something I think about. I think about a passage like Romans 1:16. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. And then what I try to do in my mind is I try to recall other passages that teach the same thing. And I think about Romans 1:16 and I go, oh, but Jude says the faith was delivered once and for all. That would go well with that passage. I think about Acts 10, where he says that not the Jews, but also the Gentiles. I think about Cornelius getting to receive the gospel and obey the gospel. I can put that with Romans 1:16. And if I keep on doing that long enough, eventually, I have a Bible lesson or a sermon that's based off that cluster of verses that were talking about the same topic. And I think that's what Stephen did in his sermon to the Sanhedrin. It's true, though. The gospel is for the Jew first and also the Greek, and is the power of salvation to all who want to have it. If there's anyone here tonight that needs to access the power of the gospel, why don't you let us assist you if you will come forward as we stand and sing. Jesus, fallen tender.